The first time I saw my ex-wife in a wedding dress, her hands shook so badly I had to steady the bouquet for her. The second time, 17 years later, I watched from the back row of a chapel I hadn't been invited to, and she didn't shake at all. She looked certain. Then the groom turned to face the guests, and for one long second, the air went out of the room for me. I knew that face. I had seen it 18 years earlier. Just before a good man's business collapsed under paperwork, Daniel Mercer had prepared, "My name is Michael Turner." I was 53 when I finally understood that my old life was over, though the truth is it had been ending quietly for a long time before that. I owned Turner Agricultural Repair just outside Fort Collins, Colorado. We fixed tractors, irrigation pumps, balers, anything that breaks during planting season when a farmer can't afford for it to break. My father started the shop. I grew up in it, married out of it, and nearly lost myself, trying to be more than it before I understood there wasn't anything wrong with what it was. Claire and I met at a hospital charity auction when I was 34. She worked event planning, moved through the room with a clipboard like she owned the air around her, and caught me bidding $300 on a spa package under my brother's name by mistake. She laughed at me before she ever said hello. I liked that. We got married 18 months later, and for a long time, the differences between us felt like something we'd built on purpose. I liked quiet nights and familiar faces. She liked rooms full of people who mattered to somebody. I taught her to change a tire on a mountain road. She taught me how to wear a suit like it belonged to me. I used to tell people our marriage worked because we balanced each other. What I didn't say, not even to myself, was how much of that balancing I left to her. I went to her work events because she asked, and I stood in the corner checking my phone, waiting for a polite hour to pass so we could leave. I told myself that showing up was the same as being present. It wasn't. Claire never said it outright, not for years, but I think she felt the difference every time. It didn't happen all at once. Somewhere around year 15, small things started changing. She stopped inviting our old friends over for dinner, the ones who'd known us since the beginning, and started going to more events alone, ones I hadn't been asked to. Every trip we took got measured against some other couple's trip to somewhere better. She'd come home from a work dinner and mention almost offhand that so-and-so's husband had just closed on a lake house, or that a client's fiancé ran his own investment fund. I heard it as small talk. It wasn't. It was Claire quietly building a case against the life we had 3 years before she ever met the man who would finally hand her the verdict. I remember one night, maybe 2 years before the end, she stood at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone while I fixed a cabinet hinge. "Do you ever wonder if this is all there is?" she asked. "This kitchen, this life." I set the screwdriver down. I could have asked her what she meant. Instead, I said something about how we traveled, how we had good friends, and went back to the hinge. That was the pattern. She'd open a door, and I'd hand her a fact instead of walking through it with her. By the time Claire sat me down at our dining table with a legal pad and a folder from a Denver law office, I wasn't shocked. I was tired in a way that felt almost like relief. She told me there was no one else. I believed her. Looking back, I think that was technically true, and also not the whole truth, but I didn't know that yet. We divided things cleanly. She kept her car and her retirement accounts. I bought out her half of the house. 11 months later, it was final, and Claire moved to Denver to run private events at a hotel downtown, and I stopped hearing her name except from mutual friends who meant well and said too much. 14 months after that, my friend Ben Alvarez sent me a photo of a cream wedding invitation and a message that read, "Thought you should know before someone else tells you. Claire Bennett and Daniel Mercer." St. Matthew's Chapel, followed by a reception at the Mercer Estate outside Boulder. Ben's construction company had done work for Daniel's firm, which was how he'd landed on the guest list in the first place. I wasn't invited. I want to be clear about that because I've turned it over enough times to know how it looks. St. Matthew's is an open parish chapel, the kind where the ceremony itself isn't a closed event, and I told myself I only wanted to see the man's face and confirm what I already half suspected. I had no plan to be seen. I stood behind a row of late arrivals near the back doors, and when Daniel Mercer turned toward the aisle to watch his bride walk toward him, I understood that Claire had just promised herself to a man I'd once watched dismantle a business and a good man's reputation without ever raising his voice. I left before the recessional. I didn't wait to see them walk back down the aisle as husband and wife. Outside, valets were pulling cars beneath white tents, and I stood by my truck with the bells still ringing behind me, feeling the same low grinding unease I get in the shop when a machine sounds wrong before anything has actually failed yet. I drove home from the chapel without turning on the radio, and somewhere past the interstate exit for Loveland, the memory surfaced, whether I wanted it or not. Daniel Mercer had been 39 the first time I met him, driving a Range Rover too clean for our gravel lot, needing an irrigation engine fixed before an inspection on some farmland he'd bought east of town. He paid my father a big cash deposit, remembered everyone's name, brought coffee to the guys on the floor like he'd known them for years. 2 weeks later, his business partner, a quiet grey-faced man named Richard Hale, showed up asking why loans had been restructured into his name without his sign-off. I heard the argument through the office wall. Daniel never raised his voice once. "You signed your name?" he kept saying, calm as a man reading a grocery list, while Richard's whole life quietly changed hands. 6 months after that, Richard's company was gone and 2 of his assets ended up in Daniel's portfolio through somebody else's name on the paperwork. My father kept every invoice, every disputed order, because Daniel had also tried to skip out on our final bill. "That man doesn't steal with his hands," my father told me once, watching Daniel's Range Rover pull out of the lot for the last time. "He gets people to hand him what he wants." I hadn't thought about Richard Hale in years, standing in that chapel watching Claire promise herself to the same man. I thought about him the whole drive home. Ben called that evening. "You disappeared," he said.
"I wasn't invited."
"You were still there?"
"I needed to see the groom's face."
There was a pause on his end. "You know Mercer. I knew him a long time ago, badly enough you should read anything he ever puts in front of you." Ben told me Daniel had given a speech at the reception about second chances, and Legacy handed Claire a diamond bracelet, announced they were buying a vineyard near Palisade. He said Claire had asked if he'd seen me. "What did you tell her?" "That you looked fine." "That's accurate."
"You're going to warn her?"
I sat with that question longer than I let on. I pictured Richard Hale's grey face in that office doorway, and I pictured Claire at the altar, chin up, certain. Whatever had ended between us, she wasn't a fool. Restless, yes. Ambitious in a way that used to make me feel like I was standing still. But not a fool. And there was something else I didn't say to Ben, something I could barely admit to myself, showing up uninvited to warn my ex-wife about her new husband the day of her wedding.
"Wasn't concern. It would sound like exactly what it might partly have been. Jealousy wearing a decent man's clothes."
"No," I said. "She made her choice. It's hers to live." Monday morning, I opened the shop at 6:30 like always. There'd been 2 voicemails the week before from a Denver number. I didn't recognize a woman's voice asking about old front range renewal records. Nothing urgent sounding. And I'd let both of them sit unreturned in the machine because harvest season doesn't wait on strangers with vague questions. By 8, we had a combine transmission spread across the bench and 2 tractors backed up in the yard. And for a few hours, the noise of the place did what it always does, which is push everything else out of my head. Then a silver sedan pulled into the lot, careful, like the driver wasn't used to gravel. A woman in her early 60s got out in a charcoal suit carrying a leather portfolio like it weighed something. She introduced herself as Margaret Shaw, an attorney out of Denver, and said she'd left messages I hadn't returned. "I'm reviewing some old records connected to Daniel Mercer," she said. "Your shop turns up in a few of them." I wiped my hands on a rag. That was 18 years ago.
I know.
"What kind of review?" "I'm not able to say who I'm representing yet." "Then I'm not able to say much about Daniel Mercer." She studied me for a second, then held out a card instead of pushing. "If you change your mind, I'm particularly interested in anything involving Richard Hale." The name landed harder than I expected, even braced for it.
Is Richard your client?
"No," she said. "He died 4 years ago. His daughter found some boxes of his old paperwork recently. It suggests Mercer may have used a similar structure since on a bigger scale." "What's that got to do with me?" "Possibly nothing." She paused, watching me carefully now. "Someone requested a certified copy of your divorce settlement about 3 weeks before the wedding. Not the public decree, the full file." The shop noise seemed to drop away behind me. "Through a private record service, hard to trace back cleanly." She tilted her head. "Did your former wife remarry recently?" 2 days ago. "To Daniel Mercer?" I nodded, and for just a second her professional calm slipped. "Men like Mercer rarely study the past." She said, closing her portfolio, "unless they intend to use it." 3 weeks passed and nothing happened. I checked in with my own divorce attorney, confirmed nobody had pulled the private financial schedules from our settlement, only the public decree, and told myself Margaret Shaw's visit was probably one of those things that looks like a pattern until it isn't. I put my father's old Mercer files back in the locked cabinet in the office and went back to running the shop like a man with nothing to worry about. Then Claire's name lit up my phone at 7:12 on a Thursday evening, and I stood at the kitchen counter with a paring knife in my hand, watching it vibrate against the wood for longer than I want to admit. She hadn't called me once since the divorce was final. Not on Christmas, not when my mother had her hip surgery, not even after she'd clocked me standing in the back of her own wedding. Michael. Her voice was softer than I remembered it being in years. "Yes, I hope this isn't a bad time." "It's not." There was restaurant noise behind her glasses, low conversation, the particular hush of a room built to make money feel unhurried. She said she wanted to apologize for the wedding, for how it must have looked seeing me there. I told her she hadn't done anything that I'd left before the reception anyway. Claire had never been good at lying to me directly, only through what she left out, and I could hear her circling something the whole call. Eventually she asked if I remembered Daniel from years back, and when I said my father's shop had repaired equipment for one of his companies, she asked, quiet and quick, and he was difficult to collect from.
That's all.
"Why are you asking?" "I'm not, I was just curious." Then faster, "I was hoping we could meet. Coffee. There are a few things I'd rather say in person. We met that Saturday at a cafe in Loveland, halfway between us." Claire showed up 10 minutes late in a camel coat and sunglasses, even though the sky was flat grey, and I noticed her wedding ring catch the light before I noticed anything else about her. She looked expensive and tired in equal measure, which is a harder combination to fake than either one alone. For a while she talked about nothing. The shop, mutual friends, the vineyard Daniel was supposedly closing on near Palisade. Then she reached into her bag and set a folded document on the table between us like she was setting down something that might go off.
I need you to look at something.
"You have attorneys." "They're Daniel's attorneys." "That's not the same thing." She didn't argue that. I opened it. A personal guarantee tied to an $8 million commercial loan for something called Mercer Ridge Holdings. Claire's name ran through the first page in language dense enough to hide behind. Joint liability, cross-collateralization, waiver of notice.
How much is the loan?
8 million, but the properties are worth far more. Daniel says it's routine just how these deals get structured.
Then why isn't he signing personally then?
He is.
As managing member, you're signing as a person, Claire. That's a different kind of exposure.
She looked down at her hands instead of at me. He added my name to the company after the wedding. What percentage?
I don't know. Have you signed anything else?
A pause. A few things.
How many?
5, maybe 6. She said it like a number she'd been avoiding counting out loud. What were they? Property transfers, insurance forms, company resolutions? He never hands me one big frightening page, Michael. He buries it in 50 ordinary ones in a stack this thick. And if I slow down to read carefully, he looks at me like I've just asked something insulting, like I don't trust him, or I'm not sophisticated enough to understand how his world works. I sat back. That mechanism was familiar in a way that made my stomach turn, not because I recognized the paperwork, but because I recognized the shape of it. Bury the danger inside the ordinary, make the asking feel like the offense. Has he ever gotten angry when you ask questions? Not violent? She met my eyes for the first time since sitting down. He just makes me feel foolish, like I wanted a bigger life and now I'm too scared to actually live in it. I pulled a napkin toward me and wrote down Margaret Shaw's name and number without saying anything for a second.
Call her.
Who is she? An attorney looking into some of Daniel's older business dealings, ones that predate you by a long time. Claire went very still. Why would someone be looking into him?
I don't know everything yet.
And you weren't going to tell me at your wedding? You could have called after. You just married him. Anything I said would have sounded like bitterness, and you know it. She looked away out at the wet street and didn't argue that either because it was true, and she knew it. Before she got in her car, she asked if I'd known Daniel was interested in her before our divorce was final. I told her no, truthfully that was all I knew at the time. She said Daniel claimed they'd only gotten close afterward and asked if I believed that. I asked if she did. She took too long to answer, and then she said, I want to wait, which isn't the same thing as yes, and we both knew that too. She drove off and I stood there in the grey morning with the uneasy sense that the conversation hadn't been about warning her at all. It had been about her looking for someone to give her permission to be afraid. That night Margaret called. Claire had reached out within the hour, sent over everything she had. Daniel's moved ownership of 3 struggling companies into Claire's name, Margaret said. 2 are already facing creditor claims. The 3rd bought the vineyard. Why would he do that? Because he needed a name that wasn't his on the exposure. And because she paused like she was choosing the next part carefully. He believed Claire still had a claim tied to the valuation of your business through the settlement. He didn't marry her for what she owned, Michael. He married her for what he thought she could still reach. I stood in my dark kitchen a long time after we hung up turning that sentence over. Daniel hadn't chased Claire because she was Claire. He'd chased what he thought was still attached to her name. It made the whole thing colder and somehow easier to sit with than believing he'd simply wanted what I once had. 6 weeks later, Ben walked into my office at the shop without sitting down and put his phone on the desk. Denver Business Ledger. Mercer Ridge Development faced a multi-million-dollar lawsuit from 2 investors claiming inflated property values and undisclosed liens. Careful language alleged disputed pending. I recognized the shape of it immediately. Daniel hadn't changed his methods, he'd just scaled them up. By that afternoon, a regional bank had frozen several Mercer accounts pending review. A subcontractor had filed a lien against the vineyard property. And at 3:15, Claire called crying so quietly I thought the line had dropped. There are people in the house, she said. Attorneys, accountants, Daniel's CFO. Since this morning, nobody will tell me anything. Where's Daniel?
I don't know. Michael the bank called me. I'm personally responsible for a loan payment due Friday, $480,000.
Don't sign anything. Don't transfer money. Don't agree to an extension over the phone. Get Margaret there before you talk to anyone. She said Margaret was already on her way, and then quieter. Did you know this was going to happen?
I knew he'd done something like it before. And you said nothing. I told you not to sign. I gave you her number. After I married him.
Yes. Her voice cracked. You stood in that chapel already knowing who he was. I knew who he'd been. I didn't know what he'd already put in your name by the time I got there. I let a beat pass. And I'll say this once because it's true and you deserve the whole truth now. Before Daniel, before any of this, I wasn't as good a husband as I let myself believe. I went to your events and stood in the corner, checking my phone. I called that showing up. It wasn't. I'm not saying that to excuse what you did.
I'm saying it so you know I'm not standing here pretending I was perfect, and you weren't.
She was quiet for a long moment. I don't know what to do with that right now. You don't have to. Just get somewhere safe and let Margaret work. Daniel called me 2 days later. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the voice. The second he spoke, unhurried, almost amused, like a man discussing weather he found mildly inconvenient. Michael Turner, it's been a while. Not long enough.
I hear Claire's been leaning on you again. Old habits.
She's not leaning on me. She's finding out what you built her into. You always did make Claire feel guilty for wanting more, Daniel said, and there was something almost gentle in how he said it, which was the worst part. I gave her a bigger life. You gave her a nice small one and called it enough. No, I said. You made her ashamed of everything she already had, so she'd stop asking questions about what you were doing with it. That's not generosity. That's a business model. I watched you run it once before on a man who trusted you. I've got the paperwork to prove it, and so does his daughter. And so does an attorney who's about 6 weeks from handing all of it to a federal prosecutor. The line went quiet for a second. When Daniel spoke again, the ease in his voice had thinned out just slightly, just enough that I heard it. You should be careful what old grudges you decide to feed, he said. I'm not feeding anything. I'm just done being quiet about what I already know. I hung up before he could answer that. 3 days after that call, Daniel sent Claire a message from some encrypted account. Tell them you handled the property filings. We can still save everything. She forwarded it straight to Margaret without responding. The next morning, I drove to Denver with 2 boxes of my father's old records. Margaret met me in a conference room at her office, and Claire sat near the window in a plain grey sweater, almost identical to the one she'd worn at our divorce mediation. She didn't say hello. I set the boxes down and opened the first one anyway. These are from the Hale business, I said. Invoices, correspondence, the restructuring paperwork my father kept when Daniel tried to skip our final bill. Margaret put on her reading glasses and started sorting. A few minutes in, she found the old work order with Daniel's signature under the clause that quietly shifted debt onto Richard's failing company. Then a letter Richard had written objecting to it. Then a bank notice proving the reassignment had gone through anyway. This establishes the pattern we need for the prosecution, Margaret said. It ties his current conduct to a history, not a mistake. Claire closed her eyes. For nearly 2 hours we worked through the boxes together, and she said almost nothing, watching every document strip another layer off the man she'd married. Near noon, Margaret stepped out to take a call from an investigator, and it was just the 2 of us. I thought he chose me because I understood his world, Claire said finally. I didn't answer that. I'd learned by then that some silences were doing more work than anything I could say into them. There's something I never told you, she said. About before. About how long before. She twisted her hands together in her lap. I met Daniel about 7 months before I filed. Not an affair. Not at first. I told myself that distinction meant something. He'd invite me to hotel events for work, ask about my ideas where I wanted to travel, made me feel like the only thing standing between me and a bigger life was fear. And I gave him things, Michael, details about the shop, the house.
Roughly what our settlement would look like before I ever filed. I told myself it was only conversation, two people talking. Looking back, I was helping him study you before I even knew that's what I was doing.
I sat with that a long moment. It didn't feel like new pain, exactly more like a shape finally getting its edges filled in. The unhappiness didn't start with him, though, I said. It started years before that. You'd stopped inviting people over, started going to things alone. Every trip we took got measured against somebody else's better one.
I know. She looked at her hands. He didn't create that in me. He found it already there and knew exactly how to use it. That doesn't make what I did to you smaller. I just need you to know it wasn't only him.
Neither of us fixed anything in that conversation. But something in the room settled anyway. The particular unglamorous relief of two people finally describing the same wreck instead of two different ones. "What happens now, she asked after a while. "You listen to Margaret. You tell the whole truth all the way through, including the parts that make you look bad. That's usually where honesty actually starts doing its job. There isn't much of my old life left to protect, anyway."
No, I agreed. There probably isn't.
For almost 2 weeks after that, investigators worked at the accounts, tracing charter flight records and passport activity tied to Daniel's companies, while Margaret's evidence built the timeline in the background. Then on a Thursday, agents arrested Daniel Mercer at a private airfield outside San Diego, boarding a flight to Costa Rica under another man's passport. The following months move the way these things move once the paperwork takes over. After months of review, prosecutors declined to charge Claire and treated her as a cooperating witness, satisfied she hadn't profited from the transfers and had turned over everything once she understood what she was looking at. The Denver house sold under court supervision. Her savings thinned considerably under legal fees. Several friends from her old life stopped returning calls, the way people do when proximity to a scandal starts to feel like risk. The hotel asked her to resign quietly before reporters started sitting in the lobby. Daniel eventually took a federal plea on fraud and conspiracy charges, and what remained of his assets went to creditors, including a settlement to Richard Hale's daughter that couldn't undo what her father lost, but at least confirmed on paper that he hadn't imagined any of it. Late that November, Claire drove out to the shop as I was closing the bay doors, the gravel lot gone hard with early frost. She was in jeans and an old green jacket I recognized from our marriage, carrying a cardboard box. "I should have called," she said. "You probably should have." Inside the box were photographs, tax records, my grandfather's pocket watch letters my mother had written us early in our marriage. Things Claire had found packed in a storage cabinet Daniel had apparently been keeping for himself in the Denver house, never unpacked since she'd moved.
"I thought these were gone," I said, turning the watch over in my palm.
"They were just sitting there this whole time," she said. "I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to go looking." I believed her. I told her so. But I also understood, standing in that cold lot with my grandfather's watch warming in my hand, that belief and trust were two different repairs, and one of them wasn't finished yet and might never fully be. A year passed the way years do when you stop watching for the next disaster. I hired Luis as service manager, someone I should have brought on years earlier, and for the first time since my father got sick, I could take a Wednesday off without checking my phone every 20 minutes. I started a woodworking class at the community college badly. My first 2 cutting boards were firewood. Ben and I drove to Wyoming for 3 days of fly fishing that produced exactly 1 fish and a sunburn. I bought a new kitchen table not because the old one was broken, but because I wanted one I'd picked out alone for no reason, but that I liked it. None of that would have impressed the people Claire used to know, that was sort of the point. I saw her again the following spring at the Saturday farmers market downtown, standing at a flower stall, studying a bucket of yellow tulips like they required a decision. She wore a plain cream sweater, no jewelry, but a small watch, her hair grown past her shoulders. Without the tailored coats, she looked more like the woman from the charity auction than the one who'd walked down that aisle. Michael.
Claire.
She held up the tulips a little. For my apartment, the woman running the stall swears they forgive you for forgetting to water them. Those are already cut, nothing left to forget. She laughed, and it wasn't the polished laugh from her hotel years. It was the older one, the one from before either of us knew what we'd eventually cost each other. We got coffee and sat on a bench by the fountain. She told me about the non-profit in Greeley where she worked, now helping women rebuild housing and finances after leaving hard marriages. There was no self-pity in how she talked about it, which surprised me more than the job itself did. "I owe you something I haven't said all the way through yet," she told me, turning her cup in her hands. I apologized for the affair. I apologized for lying. I never apologized for treating your contentment like it was a defect in you, like being steady meant you'd given up on something. You built something that held up Michael. For 18 years you came home, kept the shop alive, and gave us something steady. I looked at it and saw a cage, because I'd learned to measure a life by who envied it, instead of whether I could stand living inside it. Daniel didn't put that in me. He found it already there, and knew exactly where to put his hand.
"I forgive you," I said, and I meant it. "That doesn't mean I want our old life back." "I know," she said, and she nodded like she'd already braced for exactly that, like hearing it said. Plainly was almost a relief. I didn't come out here hoping for another chance. I thought about asking for a while. Then I realized that would just be me handing you the cost of my choices one more time.
That's further than I expected you to get on your own. It's been slower than I expected too. Before she left, she pulled one tulip free of the bunch and held it out. "Take one. I bought 12. The apartment only needs 11. I took it. I used to think losing everything would destroy me," she said. It didn't. It destroyed the person I was pretending to be, and I'm not in a hurry to build her back. I watched her walk off toward the parking lot with the rest of the tulips against her chest, and for the first time since the divorce, I didn't feel the old pull to watch until she turned around. She didn't turn around. That felt right, not sad. I put the tulip in a glass by my kitchen window that evening. It lasted 6 days. On the 7th, the petals dropped across the counter overnight, and in the morning I swept them into my hand, dropped them in the trash, and went to open the shop like any other Tuesday. For years I believed Claire left because I hadn't built a life big enough to hold her. After watching what she chased instead, and what it finally cost her to chase it, I understand something plainer now. A life isn't measured by how many people envy it from the outside. It's measured by whether you can stand inside it alone in the quiet without needing to explain yourself to anybody.
I hope she finds the life she's building now. I know I've already found mine.
Could Claire have seen through Daniel sooner, or did she need to lose the illusion? First, share your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories about betrayal, dignity, and starting over.